In early 2003, scientists detected methane in the atmosphere of Mars. Damn, we can never go there. Elon Musk is wrong. Methane is a fragile compound that falls apart when hit by ultraviolet radiation in sunlight. So what happens? When sunlight hits it, it breaks apart. We're cool with that? Okay? So any methane in the Martian atmosphere must have been released into the atmosphere relatively recently. That kind of makes sense. Why does that make sense? Or does that not make sense? Why do they think that it must have been released relatively recently? What if it had been released a long time ago?
And there probably wouldn't have been sun.
Then there probably wouldn't be sun. Right? What's the assumption here?
There is a sun and it hits Mars.
There's a sun and it hits Mars, and specifically
Methane goes away.
it hits the methane and the methane is being hit by ultraviolet radiation. So talking about the sun is a little bit off, right? Because I'm sure the test writers and most normal people would agree there is a sun in the universe and it is hitting Mars. The issue is, even though it's hitting Mars, is ultraviolet radiation hitting inside of Mars's atmosphere? Do we know? Does it say?
Well, it says it's ultraviolet radiation in sunlight.
Yeah.
So as long as the sunlight hits Mars, then the methane would
Well,
break apart.
okay, so it says methane is a fragile compound that falls apart when hit by the ultraviolet radiation in sunlight. I mean, apparently there's ultraviolet radiation in sunlight, but does that necessarily mean that it's getting into the atmosphere? I don't know. Right? Like when things hit our atmosphere, not all the stuff comes through. I guess UVB and UVA does come through, but not so much because of the ozone layer, right? That blocks some of the UVB and stuff like that. So anyways, the point here is that to get to this conclusion, to say that any methane in the Martian atmosphere must have been released into the atmosphere relatively recently, you must think that the methane is being hit by ultraviolet radiation. And therefore, if any of it does exist, it's because it was just released and hasn't been hit yet. Is hiding under a rock. Okay, so the argument relies on the assumption that Mars had no methane in its atmosphere prior to 2003. No, it could have been there. What happened?
It got hit by sunlight.
It got hit by sunlight and disappeared, right? Or whatever. All methane in the Martian atmosphere is eventually exposed to sunlight. Why do we have to assume that it's eventually exposed to sunlight? If it weren't eventually exposed to sunlight, would it disappear?
No.
No. And so then you couldn't conclude that it must have been released relatively recently. So if you negate answer choice B, the conclusion falls apart.
Right.
What answer choice did we want to pick? Or we did pick?
I picked D, but I think when I read the question, I didn't understand like what it meant, like methane falling apart meant. Like I didn't understand that it like that meant that it like was
Gone.
eliminated completely from the atmosphere.
Yeah, I mean, it's still there. It's just in a different form, right? It's like if
I
methane
did
fall-
not take like any science classes, so this one kind of.
I guess I just thought of it as like H2O. If you take H2O and separate it, then you have like, it's still, the elements still exist. They're just no longer H2O. They're no longer water. They're now something else. Yeah.
No, it was.
All right. Other answers that we were debating? D? That's it? Was that the most tempting wrong answer? You guys are so quiet. You unwilling to admit?
How would you read B with the negation test?
So it says all methane is eventually exposed. And so if I say to you all of something happened, to negate it, you just have to say not all. So at least some was not eventually exposed. So, but that still destroys the conclusion because the conclusion was really strong here. It said any methane, which is all methane, must have been released relatively recently. That doesn't have to be true if some, even just some methane, had never been exposed to ultraviolet radiation or sunlight. You guys cool with that? Okay. Any other questions on 13? Oh yeah, Johan.
No, mine was on 11.